It began as an ordinary day, the kind of day that blended into all the others in her quiet, unremarkable routine. Margaret, 78 years old and accustomed to the rhythm of her age, walked slowly through the sterile hospital corridors for what was supposed to be another routine checkup. She had grown used to these visits, where nurses greeted her with polite smiles, doctors scribbled notes in files, and time seemed to stand still beneath the fluorescent lights. She didn't expect anything extraordinary. Her life hadn't been extraordinary for a long time. But as she turned the corner and stepped into the shared hospital room, she felt the faintest tug of something she couldn't name. There were two beds in the room, one made neatly for her, and the other occupied. The man lying in the other bed looked fragile, his thin frame resting beneath a neatly folded hospital blanket, and his face turned slightly toward the window. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was soft but labored, the kind of breathing that hinted at the passage of time and the battles waged silently within a body. Margaret placed her belongings on the small side table and tried not to stare, but there was something about him, something faintly familiar in the curve of his cheek, the way his hand rested atop the blanket, and the almost imperceptible furrow in his brow. She couldn't place it. Dismissing the thought as one of those tricks memory plays when nostalgia mingles with the present, she sat down on the edge of her bed and opened the book she had brought to pass the time. Yet she couldn't focus. Every few moments, her eyes would drift back to him, scanning his face for answers to a question she hadn't even formed yet. It wasn't until the nurse entered the room to check his vitals that Margaret heard his voice for the first time. It was faint, barely above a whisper, but it carried a certain rhythm that stopped her cold. He asked the nurse something about his medication, a simple question, nothing remarkable, and yet to her it was as though she had been struck by lightning. That voice. It was distant but achingly familiar, tugging at a part of her heart she had buried long ago. Her hands trembled as she fumbled to turn the page of her book, though she wasn't reading anymore. Memories she thought she had forgotten surfaced all at once. A summer picnic by the lake, the sound of laughter echoing under a canopy of stars, and the warmth of a hand intertwined with hers. Margaret stole another glance at him, her mind racing. It couldn't be. It was impossible. And yet every fiber of her being screamed otherwise. When the nurse left the room, the silence that followed was deafening. Gathering her courage, she spoke, her voice hesitant, quivering like a leaf in the wind. "Excuse me," she said, almost regretting it as the words left her lips, "but do I know you?" The man stirred at the sound of her voice. Slowly, almost cautiously, he turned his head toward her, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. Time seemed to stop in that moment. The hospital, the sterile walls, the world itself, all of it faded away as recognition flickered in his gaze. He stared at her as though seeing a ghost, his lips parting slightly as if to speak but finding no words. Margaret's heart raced. Could it really be him? After all these years? She hadn't spoken his name in decades, hadn't even dared to think about him for fear of reopening old wounds. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but his words hit her like a tidal wave. "Margaret," he said, the name rolling off his tongue with a familiarity that sent shivers down her spine. Her breath caught, her chest tightening as tears welled up in her eyes. It was him. There was no mistaking it now. The man lying in the hospital bed beside hers was not a stranger after all. He was the boy she had once loved with all her heart, the man she had let go of so many years ago, the one she thought she would never see again. And in that instant, Margaret knew her life would never be the same. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, her thoughts spinning wildly as she stared at the man who had just spoken her name. It wasn't just the sound of it. It was the way he said it, soft and familiar, as if no time had passed at all. Yet time had passed, more than 50 years. Her heart ached at the realization, both for the decades that had separated them, and for the girl she had been when she had last seen him. She had been so young then, so full of hope and fire, and he had been her world. His name escaped her lips before she could stop herself. "James," she asked, her voice trembling. The name felt strange and wonderful in her mouth, like a long-forgotten melody that had suddenly returned to her. James didn't answer immediately. His eyes, pale blue but dimmed by the weight of years, searched her face as though piecing together a puzzle. Finally, he gave a small nod, and the corners of his mouth lifted in a faint smile that still carried the echoes of the boy she had once known. "It's been a long time," he said, his voice raspy but warm. The simplicity of his words belied the enormity of the moment, and Margaret felt her chest tighten with emotion. How long had it been? 55 years? 56? It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here, alive, and looking at her with the same tenderness she remembered. She didn't know how to respond. The silence between them stretched on, filled with unspoken questions and unacknowledged pain. Finally, James broke it. "I wondered if I'd ever see you again," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving hers. "But a life has a way of pulling people apart, doesn't it?" His words hit Margaret like a blow, stirring memories she had tried so hard to bury. She saw herself as a young woman, standing on the platform of the small-town train station, tears streaming down her face as James boarded the train that would take him away. He had kissed her then, a kiss filled with promises they couldn't keep, and whispered that he would come back for her. But he hadn't. "I thought you'd forgotten about me," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the truth she had carried with her for so many years, the belief that James had moved on, leaving her behind to pick up the pieces of a shattered dream. James shook his head, his expression one of quiet sorrow. "I could never forget you," he said. "But things got complicated." His words hung in the air, heavy with regret, and Margaret felt a familiar pang of sadness. She had spent so many nights after he left, wondering what had gone wrong, replaying their last moments together in her mind until they became a blur of heartbreak and longing. She found herself speaking before she could stop. "You didn't come back," she said, her voice breaking. "You said you would, but you didn't." James looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "I wanted to," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wrote you letters, dozens of them. But your father, he made sure you'd never see them." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the weight of his words sank in. "My father," she repeated, her mind racing. James nodded, his jaw tightening. "He came to see me before I left," he said. "Told me that if I really loved you, I'd let you go. Said he had plans for you, a life he thought you deserved, and I wasn't part of it." Margaret felt a surge of anger and sorrow rise within her. Her father had always been a stern man, set in his ways, and she had long suspected he hadn't approved of James. But to go so far as to sabotage their love? She felt tears prick her eyes as the years of misunderstandings and unanswered questions came rushing back. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought you didn't care." James reached out then, his hand trembling as it found hers. "I cared," he said, his voice filled with quiet desperation. "I cared more than you could ever know. Letting you go was the hardest thing I've ever done." Margaret felt the tears spill over, tracing lines down her cheeks as she clung to his hand. The years between them seemed to dissolve in that moment, leaving only the echoes of the love they had once shared. "I waited for you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I waited for so long." James's eyes glistened with tears of his own. "And I waited for the day I'd find you again," he said. "Even when it felt impossible, I held on to the hope that somehow, some way, we'd meet again." The room grew quiet, the only sounds the rhythmic beeping of James's monitors and the faint hum of life outside their shared bubble. Margaret felt a deep sadness settle over her as she realized how much time they had lost, time they could never get back. But as she looked into James's eyes, she also felt a flicker of something else, hope. The kind of hope that reminded her it was never too late to find closure, to mend what had been broken. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, life had given them a second chance. Margaret sat by James's bedside long after the nurses had completed their rounds, her mind swirling with memories and unspoken words. The weight of their reunion was almost too much to bear, and yet she couldn't bring herself to leave. As the silence between them stretched, it wasn't awkward. It was heavy with the unsaid truths of two lives that had diverged so completely and yet somehow found their way back together. Finally, James broke the stillness, his voice soft but steady. "You must have built a beautiful life," he said, his eyes searching hers for answers to the years they had lost. Margaret hesitated, her heart aching with the complexity of her response. How could she explain the years that had passed without him, the choices she had made, the sacrifices she had accepted as her reality? "I did what I had to," she began, her voice measured, as if testing the waters of vulnerability. "After you left, or rather, after I thought you'd left me, well, I didn't have much of a choice. My father pushed me to marry someone he approved of, someone who could offer me the kind of stability he thought I needed." James's expression didn't change, but his eyes dimmed slightly, as though the words struck a core of pain he had been bracing for. Margaret sighed deeply, the memories flooding back with vivid clarity. "His name was Charles," she continued. "He was kind, steady, and everything my father wanted for me. At first, I resisted, but after months of hearing that it was for the best, I gave in. I convinced myself it was the right thing to do." James's hand, still holding hers, tightened slightly. "Did you love him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question cut deeper than she expected, and Margaret found herself grappling with the truth. "I did, in my own way," she said, her gaze fixed on their intertwined hands. "But it was never the same. He wasn't you, James. He couldn't be." The confession felt like a betrayal, even after all these years, but it was the truth, and James deserved nothing less. "Charles gave me a good life," she added quickly, as if to justify her choices. "We had 2 children together, a boy and a girl. They were my everything for so many years." James nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding that only deepened Margaret's guilt. "And Charles?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. Margaret hesitated, then took a deep breath. "He passed away 10 years ago," she said softly. "Heart failure. It was sudden and it was hard, but by then our marriage had become more of a partnership than anything else. We cared for each other, but the passion, the spark, it had faded long before." She looked up at James, her eyes brimming with unspoken sorrow. "I stayed with him because it was the life I chose. I told myself it was what I deserved after losing you." James shook his head, his brow furrowing. "Margaret," he said firmly, "you didn't lose me. I was taken from you." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared pain. Margaret felt her throat tighten, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. "But I let it happen," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't fight hard enough. I let my father control me, and I let you go without a fight." James reached up with his free hand, brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "We were young," he said gently. "We didn't know how to fight back then. We thought the world would wait for us, but it didn't." Margaret's mind drifted to the life she had built without him, the milestones and moments that had shaped her into the woman she was now. "I've been a grandmother for 12 years, she said, faint smile tugging at her lips despite the tears. "My grandchildren are my greatest joy. They keep me busy, remind me of what it was like to be young and full of wonder." James smiled back, though it was tinged with sadness. "I would have liked to meet them," he said softly. Margaret's heart ached at the thought of the life they could have shared, the family they might have built together. But as much as she mourned what could have been, she couldn't ignore the reality of what was. My life wasn't perfect, she admitted, her voice steady but filled with emotion. But it was mine. I tried to find happiness where I could, even if I always felt like a piece of me was missing. James nodded, his expression one of quiet resignation. And now, he asked, his voice trembling slightly, do you feel complete now that we're here, talking like this? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out the window, her mind racing with the implications of his question. Did she feel complete? Or did their reunion only serve to highlight the emptiness she had carried for so long? I don't know, she said finally, her voice barely audible. But I know I've missed you every single day. James squeezed her hand again, his grip weak but filled with meaning. I've missed you too, he said simply, and for a moment, the weight of the years seemed to lift, leaving only the fragile hope of the present. They sat in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Margaret's mind wandered to the life she had lived without him, the choices she had made, and the love she had tried to recreate but never fully found again. And as she looked at James, lying there in the hospital bed, she couldn't help but wonder if fate was offering them one last chance to make things right. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the machines monitoring James's fragile body. Margaret sat at his bedside, heart heavy with questions that had no easy answers. Their reunion, bittersweet as it was, felt like a fragile thread tethering her to a life she thought she had long left behind. But James's expression, the way his eyes seemed to flicker with something unresolved, told her that their story wasn't finished, not yet. James took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with effort, and turned his head toward her. Margaret, he began, his voice strained but steady. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago. Margaret froze, her pulse quickening. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear whatever he was about to say, but she knew she couldn't walk away now. What is it? She asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. James's gaze dropped to the blanket covering his lap, his hands fidgeting with its edges. After your father came to me that day, he began slowly. He didn't just tell me to leave. He made it impossible for me to stay. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James sighed deeply, the sound filled with decades of regret. Your father didn't just disapprove of me, he said, his voice cracking. He saw me as a threat to the future he wanted for you. He told me that if I truly loved you, I'd let you go. But he didn't stop there. He paused, his hands trembling as he continued. He threatened my family, Margaret. Said he'd ruin my father's business, destroy everything we had, if I didn't stay away from you. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock. No, she whispered, shaking her head as if to deny the possibility. He wouldn't. He couldn't. But deep down, she knew the truth. Her father had always been a proud, controlling man who believed he knew what was best for her, no matter the cost. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice breaking. Why didn't you fight harder for us? James looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I did fight, he said quietly. I came back for you, Margaret. I came back to try and make things right. But when I returned, your father told me you were already engaged to Charles. He said you were happy, that you had moved on. Margaret gasped, the weight of his words hitting her like a blow. That's not true, she said, her voice trembling. I wasn't happy. I wasn't engaged. I was waiting for you. James shook his head slowly, his expression one of quiet sorrow. I didn't know that, he said softly. I believed him. I thought I was doing the right thing by letting you go. Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks as the years of misunderstanding and lost opportunities came crashing down around her. He lied to both of us, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He took away our chance at happiness. James reached out, his hand trembling as it found hers. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice filled with pain. "If I had known, if I had even suspected, I would have moved heaven and earth to be with you." Margaret clung to his hand, her heart aching with the weight of all they had lost. "I thought you didn't love me anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought you had forgotten about me." James shook his head, his grip tightening around hers. "I never forgot you," he said firmly. "Not for a single day. Even after I left, even after everything fell apart, you were always with me. In my thoughts, in my dreams, in every decision I made." Margaret felt her chest tighten, her emotions swinging wildly between anger and heartbreak. "Why didn't you try again?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you come back after I was married? After my father couldn't control me anymore?" James hesitated, his gaze dropping once more. "Because I thought I had no right to," he said finally. "You had a family, a life. I didn't want to disrupt that. And by the time I felt strong enough to try, years had passed, and I told myself it was too late." Margaret closed her eyes, her heart aching with the weight of his words. "It was never too late," she whispered. "I would have welcomed you back, James. I would have chosen you, even then." The room grew quiet, the gravity of their conversation settling over them like a heavy fog. Margaret's mind raced, replaying the years they had lost, the moments they could have shared, and the life they might have built together. But as she looked at James, lying there in the hospital bed, she realized that despite everything, they had been given a gift, a second chance to confront the past, to find closure, and perhaps even to heal. "You were always my first love," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "And you always will be." James smiled faintly, his eyes brimming with emotion. "And you were mine," he replied. "No matter how much time has passed, that will never change." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of their shared history, their regrets, and the fragile hope that perhaps, even now, it wasn't too late to make things right. The air in the room was thick with the weight of their shared revelations, but neither Margaret nor James seemed ready to let the silence settle for long. There was too much left unsaid, too many pieces of their fractured story that needed to be brought into the light. Margaret leaned forward in her chair, her hands still wrapped tightly around James's frail fingers. "James," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I need to know what happened to you after you left. After my father, after everything." Her words hung in the air, carrying a quiet desperation that made James close his eyes for a moment, as though bracing himself for the memories he was about to unearth. "I tried to rebuild my life," he said finally, his voice low and tinged with exhaustion. "But it wasn't easy. After I left you, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I didn't know who I was without you, Margaret. I spent months trying to figure out what to do, where to go. I ended up enlisting in the army. It seemed like the only way to escape the pain, to find some kind of purpose." Margaret's breath hitched, and her grip on his hand tightened. She could see it now. The young man she had loved so fiercely, thrown into a world of violence and chaos, all because her father had deemed him unworthy. "The army," she whispered, her voice trailing off as she imagined what he must have endured. James nodded, his gaze distant. "I spent years overseas," he continued. "It was hard, harder than I ever could have imagined. But it gave me structure, something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping away. I saw things, Margaret, things I wouldn't wish on anyone. And yet, through it all, you were always there in the back of my mind. You were my anchor, even when I had no hope of seeing you again." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to his words, her heart aching for the boy she had loved and the man he had become. "Why didn't you come back after the war?" she asked, her voice trembling. James sighed deeply, his expression one of quiet sorrow. "I thought about it," he admitted. "Every day, I thought about coming back to find you. But when the war ended, I wasn't the same person anymore. I felt broken, Margaret. I didn't want to bring that version of myself into your life." Margaret shook her head, her tears spilling over. "You should have come back anyway," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't care who you had become, James. I would have taken you as you were, broken, scarred, anything. I just wanted you." James looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know that now," he said softly, "but back then I couldn't see it. I told myself I was doing the right thing by staying away, by letting you live the life your father had planned for you. I thought I was protecting you." Margaret felt a surge of anger rise within her, not at James, but at the circumstances that had conspired to keep them apart. "You didn't protect me, James," she said, her voice firm. "You left me to live a life I didn't choose. I loved Charles, but I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a single day." James's expression crumpled at her words, and he reached out to touch her cheek, his hand trembling. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "For everything. For not fighting harder, for believing your father's lies, for letting fear and pride keep me from you." Margaret leaned into his touch, her tears falling freely now. "And I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking, "for not seeing through my father's manipulation, for not searching for you when I knew something wasn't right. We both made mistakes, James. But we were so young. How could we have known any better?" James nodded, his eyes brimming with understanding. "We couldn't have," he said softly. "But that doesn't make it any easier to accept, does it?" They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared pain pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. But as Margaret looked at James, she realized that the sadness she felt was tempered by something else: gratitude. Gratitude for the chance to sit here, to talk to him, to finally understand the truth of what had happened all those years ago. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling with both hope and fear. James smiled faintly, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and warmth. "Every day," he admitted. "I think about the life we could have had, the family we could have built, the years we could have spent together. But life doesn't always give us what we want, does it?" Margaret nodded, her chest tightening. "No," she said softly, "but sometimes it gives us second chances." James's expression shifted, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Do you think this is our second chance, Margaret?" he asked, his voice trembling. Margaret hesitated, her mind racing with the possibilities and the risks. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think we owe it to ourselves to find out." The room fell silent once more, but this time it wasn't a silence of pain or regret. It was a silence filled with the quiet hope of two people who, despite everything, had found their way back to each other. And in that moment, Margaret realized that while they could never reclaim the years they had lost, they still had the present, and perhaps even a future, waiting for them to make it right. The hospital room, bathed in a soft afternoon light, seemed to shrink as Margaret's thoughts shifted to her family. For decades, she had kept her memories of James locked away, hidden even from those closest to her. She had told herself it was better that way, simpler, cleaner. But now, with James beside her, their hands intertwined like a fragile bridge to the past, she realized the truth could no longer stay buried. Her children deserved to know. Her grandchildren deserved to understand. And perhaps she needed their understanding too. As if on cue, the door creaked open, and Margaret's daughter, Emily, stepped in, carrying a bag of fresh clothes and Margaret's favorite tea. Emily's bright smile faltered slightly as she saw her mother sitting so close to the man in the hospital bed, her expression softer and more vulnerable than Emily had ever seen. "Mom," Emily asked, her voice hesitant. Is everything okay? Margaret's heart tightened at the sight of her daughter, the same way it always did when she saw the reflection of her late husband in Emily's gentle features. Emily, Margaret said, her voice steady but warm, come here. There's someone I'd like you to meet. Emily approached cautiously, her eyes darting between her mother and the man she didn't recognize. This is James, Margaret continued, her grip on his hand tightening slightly. He's someone I knew a long time ago. Emily frowned, her confusion evident. A long time ago, she echoed, her gaze shifting to James, who offered her a faint smile. It's a pleasure to meet you, James said, his voice kind but weak. I've heard so much about you. Emily's brow furrowed further. You've heard about me? She asked, her tone skeptical. How do you know my mom? Margaret took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to speak. James was my first love, she said quietly, her eyes fixed on her daughter's face. Emily's eyes widened, her mouth opening slightly in shock. Your first love, she repeated, as though the words didn't quite make sense. Margaret nodded, her heart pounding. Before I met your father, before I had you and your brother, James, we were everything to each other. But life pulled us apart. Emily's expression softened slightly, but her confusion remained. Why didn't I know about him? She asked, her voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and hurt. You've never mentioned him before. Margaret hesitated, her mind racing as she searched for the right words. Because it was too painful, she admitted. For so many years, I thought I had lost him forever. I told myself it was easier to forget, to focus on the life I built with your father. But James was always there in my heart, even when I tried to bury him. Emily's gaze shifted to James, her expression unreadable. And now, she asked softly, what does this mean now? Margaret glanced at James, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange of emotions too complex to name. It means that sometimes life gives us a second chance, she said, her voice trembling. And I'm not sure what to do with it yet. Emily was silent for a moment, her thoughts clearly racing. Then she pulled up a chair, sitting down beside her mother. Tell me everything, she said, her voice firm but kind. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her, even as her chest tightened with the weight of the story she was about to share. For the next hour, Margaret spoke, her words pouring out like a flood as she recounted the summer she had met James, the nights they had spent dreaming about the future, and the cruel circumstances that had torn them apart. She told Emily about her father's interference, James's attempts to come back, and the years of silence that had followed. James chimed in occasionally, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words, filling in the gaps with his own memories and regrets. Emily listened intently, her expression shifting between sadness, anger, and quiet understanding. So, grandfather, she began, her voice trailing off as the realization hit her. He kept you apart? Margaret nodded, her heart aching at the thought of her father's betrayal. He thought he was protecting me, she said softly, but all he did was break both our hearts. Emily sighed deeply, her fingers running through her hair. I always thought I knew everything about you, she said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. But this changes so much. Margaret reached out, placing a hand on her daughter's arm. It doesn't change who I am, she said gently. It just adds another layer to the story of my life. Emily nodded slowly, her gaze softening. I'm glad you told me, she said. And I'm glad you found him again. She turned to James, offering him a small but genuine smile. Thank you for coming back, she said simply. James's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thank you for giving me the chance, he replied. As the conversation continued, Margaret felt a weight lift from her chest. For the first time in decades, she felt truly seen, not just as a mother or a widow, but as a woman with a past, a heart, and story that was still unfolding. And as Emily left the room to call her brother and share the news, Margaret turned to James, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "I was afraid of how they'd react," she admitted. "But I should have known better. They're my children. They understand." James smiled faintly, his hand squeezing hers. "They're a reflection of you," he said, "and I can see why you're so proud of them." Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. For so many years, she had carried the burden of her past alone, but now with her family by her side and James back in her life, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades: hope. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't face it alone. The soft hum of the hospital room settled into the background as Margaret stared at James, their shared truths now lingering in the air like fragile threads holding them together. Her heart was lighter after telling Emily, but questions still gnawed at her. Questions about what the future held, and whether their reunion, as profound as it was, could ever truly heal the wounds of their past. James, sensing her unease, gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of something he had yet to share. "There's more I need to tell you." Margaret felt her breath catch. She had thought the hardest revelations were behind them, but the tone in James's voice sent a chill down her spine. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James looked down at their hands, his frail fingers trembling against hers. "Before I ended up here," he began, "there was something I wanted to do, something I've been carrying for years, waiting for the right moment. But I don't think I have much time left, and you deserve to know." Margaret's heart tightened at his words, the implication of them cutting through her like a blade. "Don't say that," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "You're here now. That's what matters." James shook his head slowly, his gaze filled with both sorrow and determination. "No, Margaret," he said firmly. "What matters is that I make things right before it's too late." Margaret was silent, her mind racing as she tried to prepare herself for whatever he was about to reveal. James took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers with a depth of emotion that made her chest ache. "After I left you, I tried to move on," he said, his voice trembling. "But I couldn't. I carried you with me everywhere I went. And when I finally accepted that we weren't meant to be, I made a promise to myself, a promise to honor the love we shared, even if it was from a distance." Margaret frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What kind of promise?" she asked. James hesitated, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I wanted to protect you, Margaret," he said quietly, "even if I couldn't be with you. So, I kept an eye on you over the years." Margaret's eyes widened, her breath hitching. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and unease. James sighed deeply, his gaze dropping to his lap. "I didn't interfere," he said quickly, as though to reassure her. "I never wanted to disrupt your life, but I stayed close enough to know that you were safe, that you were happy." Margaret felt a wave of emotions wash over her, shock, disbelief, and an odd sense of comfort all at once. "You watched over me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "All this time?" James nodded slowly, his expression one of quiet resignation. "I thought it was the only thing I could do for you," he admitted. "I told myself it was enough. But now, sitting here with you, I realize how much I let my fear control me. I should have come back sooner. I should have fought for us." Margaret's heart ached at his words, the regret in his voice cutting through her like a knife. "You did what you thought was right," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "And now we have this moment. That's what matters." James smiled faintly, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "You've always been stronger than me, Margaret," he said. "Even now, you're giving me more grace than I deserve." He paused, his expression growing serious once more. "But there's one more thing I need to tell you. something I've kept from you for far too long." Margaret's stomach tightened as she braced herself for his next words. "What is it, James?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. James took another deep breath, his gaze unwavering as he spoke. "After the war, I came back to your town one last time," he said. "I wanted to see you, to tell you everything. But when I got there, I saw you with Charles. You were happy, or at least you looked happy, and I told myself that was enough. I didn't want to ruin what you had, so I walked away." Margaret felt her heart break all over again, the image of James watching her from the shadows sending a shiver down her spine. "You should have come to me," she said, her voice cracking. "I wasn't happy, James. I was surviving. There's a difference." James nodded, his expression filled with quiet sorrow. "I know that now," he said softly. "But at the time, I thought I was doing the right thing. And I've lived with that decision every day since." Margaret reached out, her hand cupping his cheek as tears streamed down her face. "We both made mistakes," she said, her voice trembling. "But we're here now. And we have a chance to make things right, even if it's just for a little while." James leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as a single tear slid down his cheek. "You're right," he said. "We can't change the past, but we can choose what to do with the time we have left." As the weight of his confession settled over them, Margaret felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The pain and regret of their past would always be a part of them, but so too would the love that had endured despite it all. And in that moment, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the hospital room as Margaret and James sat in the stillness of their shared truths. For hours, they had talked, unpacking decades of pain and regret, rediscovering the love they thought they had lost. Yet, as the day drew to a close, a sense of finality began to creep in, one Margaret couldn't quite bring herself to acknowledge. James, though frail, seemed more at peace than she had ever seen him, and that peace made her uneasy, as though he knew something she didn't. James shifted slightly in his bed, his hands still intertwined with hers. "Margaret," he said softly, breaking the silence. "There's something I need to ask you, one last thing." Margaret's chest tightened at his words, the gravity in his tone making her throat dry. "Anything," she replied, her voice trembling. "You can ask me anything." James looked at her, his pale blue eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Do you regret the life you had without me?" Margaret felt her breath catch, her mind racing. How could she possibly answer that? She thought of her children, her grandchildren, the life she had built with Charles. It hadn't been perfect, but it had been hers. And yet, the thought of what might have been with James had always lingered in the back of her mind, like a shadow that refused to fade. "I don't regret my life," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion swirling within her. "I love my children, my grandchildren, and I care deeply for Charles. But if I'm being honest," she paused, her gaze locking with his, "I've always wondered what our life would have been like. I've always wondered if I made the right choice. And now, sitting here with you, I realize that part of me never truly let you go." James smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "I never let you go either," he said. "Not for a single day." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes as she leaned forward, her forehead resting gently against his. "You were my first love, James," she whispered, "and you'll be my last." The words hung in the air, filling the room with a bittersweet tenderness that seemed to transcend time. For a moment, Margaret allowed herself to believe that they had been given a second chance, that the years they had lost could somehow be reclaimed. But as she looked at James, at the fragility of his body and the weariness in his eyes, she knew the truth. Their time was running out. "I need to tell you something," James said suddenly, his voice trembling. Margaret pulled back, her heart pounding. "What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with both curiosity and dread. James hesitated, his gaze dropping to their joined hands. "When I came back to town all those years ago, I didn't just watch you from a distance," he began. I left something for you." Margaret frowned, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around hers. "I wrote you a letter," he said. "I poured everything into it, everything I couldn't say to your face. I left it with your father, hoping he would give it to you." Margaret felt her stomach drop, her pulse quickening. "A letter," she repeated, her voice trembling. James nodded, his expression one of quiet sorrow. "I never knew if you got it," he said softly, "but I needed you to know, even if it was too late, how much I loved you." Margaret's mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragments of their story. She had never received a letter from James, never even known it existed. "I never got it," she said, her voice breaking. "My father, he must have kept it from me." James closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his face. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. I thought you knew." Margaret shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "I didn't know," she said, her voice trembling. "But I know now. And that's what matters." James smiled faintly, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You were always stronger than me, Margaret," he said. "Always braver." As the room grew quieter, the weight of their shared history seemed to settle over them like a heavy blanket. Margaret leaned closer, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Where is the letter now?" she asked. "Do you think it's still out there?" James hesitated, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if it is, maybe it's time you found it." Margaret nodded, a spark of determination igniting within her. "I will," she said firmly. "I'll find it, James. I'll make sure your words are finally heard." James smiled, his eyes closing as a wave of exhaustion washed over him. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Margaret watched as his breathing slowed, her heart breaking as she realized their time together was coming to an end. But as she sat there, holding his hand and whispering words of love and gratitude, she felt a profound sense of peace. They couldn't change the past, but they had found each other in the end, and that was enough. 2 days later, Margaret stood in her father's old house, now a storage space for family heirlooms. As she sifted through boxes of forgotten belongings, her hands trembling with both anticipation and fear, she found it, a yellowed envelope with her name written in James's unmistakable handwriting. With tears streaming down her face, she opened it, reading words that had been waiting for her for over 50 years. In that moment, Margaret felt the years melt away, her heart swelling with both sorrow and joy. James's love had endured, even through the cruelty of time and circumstance. And as she held the letter close to her chest, she whispered a promise to the man she had always loved. "I'll carry you with me always,